She worked with the quiet urgency of someone who had learned that daylight was not a gift but a resource that could run out without warning. Her hands rough and nicked, gripping splintered boards scavenged from the ruins of an old freight crate, boards that were warped by rain and sun and history, boards that should have been thrown away years ago, yet here she was, pressing them together as if belief alone might straighten what the world had bent. The wind moved through the high grass of the valley in long sighs, carrying dust and the smell of cattle and distant pine, and every so often it lifted the edge of her worn shawl and exposed the thin blue veins on her wrists, proof of how little time and kindness had fed her lately. She had chosen the edge of the ravine because the slope cut the wind, because the land dipped there like a cupped hand, offering some small protection from the coming cold nights, and because no one ever came that far unless they had a reason. Her reason was survival. She leaned one broken board against another, squinting as if alignment were a matter of will, then reached for a rusted nail, the kind that bent before it bit, and tapped it with a stone she had shaped into a hammer through weeks of trial and error. Each strike rang too loud in her ears, as if the sound itself might betray her presence to a world that had already proven it could take more than it gave. She paused often listening, not just for footsteps or hooves, but for the deeper signs of danger. She had learned to read since the day she had been left alone with nothing but what she could carry. Hunger had sharpened her senses, loss had taught her silence, and hope. Hope was something she handled carefully now, like fire in dry grass. From the ridge above, the rancher watched. He had not meant to. His ride that morning was supposed to be routine, a slow loop around the far fence line where elk sometimes broke through, but the movement near the ravine had caught his eye the way a flicker of light catches you before you know why. He reined his horse and shaded his eyes, and that was when he saw her, small against the land, bending and straightening, lifting boards that looked heavier than she was, stubbornly fitting them together. He had lived on that land most of his life, long enough to know when something didn't belong, and a half-built shelter made of scrap certainly didn't. His first instinct was caution. Out here, strangers could mean trouble, and trouble had a way of lingering long after it rode in. He had learned that lesson young, when his father's kindness to the wrong man had cost them half their herd and nearly the ranch itself. So he stayed where he was, watching from afar, telling himself it was none of his business, telling himself she'd move on, telling himself that watching was not the same as caring. But the longer he looked, the more details he noticed. The way she favored her left foot, the careful economy of her movements, the way she stopped to rest with her hands braced on her knees, breathing through pain she didn't want to admit to. This wasn't someone passing through. This was someone trying to stay. She didn't know she was being watched. Or maybe she suspected it in the way you sometimes feel eyes on your back without proof. She worked faster, as if urgency could keep loneliness at bay. And when one of the boards cracked under pressure, she closed her eyes for a long moment, steadying herself against despair that threatened to spill over. She had promised herself she would not cry again, not out here where tears could freeze before they hit the ground, where weakness felt like an invitation to disaster. Instead, she adjusted, repositioned, found another angle, because that was what she had always done, adapted when the world refused to bend. The shelter was little more than a lean-to, its roof a patchwork of boards, and old canvas she had traded for in the last town she passed through, a town that had looked at her with suspicion and pity in equal measure, and she knew it wouldn't last a hard storm, but it might buy her a few nights, might give her a place to lie down without feeling the sky press in from all sides. The rancher shifted in his saddle. His horse flicked an ear, sensing his rider's tension, and he reached down to stroke its neck, grounding himself. He told himself again that this was not his concern. He had fences to mend, cattle to check, a life already full of responsibility and the quiet weight of old regrets. But the image of her struggling with those boards would not leave him alone. It stirred something he had tried to bury after his wife's death, after the house had grown too quiet and the land too wide. Compassion, he had learned, was a dangerous thing when you lived where help was scarce and consequences were long. Yet he remembered his mother years ago, building a windbreak with whatever she could find after a fire took their barn, remembered the way neighbors had shown up without being asked, lumber and nails in hand, because that was how people survived out here, together or not at all. Down below, the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the ravine like fingers, and she felt the temperature shift, the warning chill that came before dusk. She drove the last nail as best she could and stepped back, assessing her work with a critical eye that softened despite itself. It was crooked. It was fragile. But it was hers, built with determination and the refusal to disappear. She gathered the scraps into a small pile, conserving what little she had left. And then she sat on the ground, back against the shelter, and let herself breathe. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to sleep without one ear open, to wake without fear, to have someone ask her name and mean it. The thought was dangerous, and she pushed it away, pulling her shawl tighter as the first stars pricked the sky. The rancher made his decision then. He rode in at first light, the sky a pale promise over the hills, the smell of dew and hay clinging to the morning air, and the sound of hooves carried down into the ravine before she saw him, a rhythmic thunder that made her heart leap into her throat as she scrambled to her feet, every muscle tense, every instinct screaming danger. She reached for the knife she kept hidden at her waist, more comfort than weapon, and stood in front of her, shelter as if her body alone could protect the fragile thing she had built. When he came into view, tall in the saddle, hat brim low, the horse calm and well-kept, she measured him in a glance the way she had learned to measure everyone. Hands, posture, the set of his shoulders, whether his eyes were hard or wary or something else entirely. He stopped a respectful distance away, reins loose, and lifted one hand in a gesture that was neither command nor threat, just acknowledgement. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying easily, unforced, and she realized with a strange flicker of surprise that it had been a long time since anyone had greeted her as if she belonged to the day. He told her his name, simple and unadorned, and waited, giving her space to decide whether she would answer. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, thin but steady, and she gave him her name as if testing it, as if making sure it still fit. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate, and gestured toward the wagon he had brought, its bed stacked with lumber that gleamed pale and clean in the morning light. "I saw what you were building," he said, not accusing, not pitying, just stating a fact. And she felt a flush of embarrassment rise despite herself, pride and vulnerability tangling in her chest. She braced herself for judgment, for questions she didn't want to answer, but instead he continued, "Those boards won't hold long. Storm comes through here hard." He paused, eyes flicking to her shelter and back to her face. "I've got better. Wood. Nails. Thought you might want them." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Help always came with strings. She had learned that the hard way, and her first instinct was refusal, sharp and immediate. She opened her mouth to say no, to tell him she didn't need anything, that she was fine, that she would manage, but the words tangled with the truth she could not ignore, that she was tired, that the nights were cold, that pride did not keep out the rain. He seemed to sense the battle behind her eyes and waited, patient as the land itself. When she finally nodded, it felt less like surrender and more like a careful step onto uncertain ground. He smiled then, not wide or triumphant, just a small easing of his features, and together they walked to the wagon. He handed her a board, straight and solid, and the weight of it surprised her, not just physically but emotionally, because it represented something she had almost forgotten: possibility. They worked side by side without much talk at first, falling into a rhythm that felt natural, him measuring and cutting with practiced ease, her holding and hammering, learning the right angle, the right pressure. He showed her how to brace the frame, how to set the roof so water would run off instead of pooling, how to anchor the base against the wind, and with each small lesson, she felt a piece of herself strengthen along with the shelter. The old boards were replaced one by one, not discarded but reinforced, their history woven into something sturdier, and she thought how much that felt like her own life. Broken pieces not erased, just supported until they could stand. As the sun climbed higher, conversation crept in around the edges of their work. He asked where she'd come from, not pressing when she hesitated, and shared stories of the land, of winters that tested even the prepared, of summers that baked the earth until it cracked. He talked about his ranch, about the quiet that had settled there after loss, and though he did not name it directly, she understood the shape of his grief because it mirrored her own in ways that surprised them both. By midday, the shelter stood transformed, its lines clean and strong. Its presence no longer an apology but a statement. She stepped back, hands on her hips, and laughed, a short, startled sound that escaped before she could stop it, and he joined her, the shared moment lightening something between them that had been heavy since their first meeting. When it was done, he didn't linger awkwardly or make demands. He offered her water, food from his saddlebag, which she accepted with gratitude she no longer tried to hide, and then he told her she could stay there as long as she needed, that the land was his but it was wide enough to share, that he would check in when he rode the fence but would not intrude if she wanted solitude. The offer was given freely without expectation, and that was what made it so powerful. She watched him mount his horse, the sun catching the dust as he turned to leave, and for the first time in a long while, the future did not feel like an enemy, waiting just beyond the horizon. Days passed, then weeks, and the shelter became a home in small, meaningful ways. A place for a fire pit, a hook for her pack, a door fashioned from canvas that flapped cheerfully in the breeze. The rancher kept his word, stopping by with supplies, sometimes staying to talk, sometimes just tipping his hat and riding on, and in that steady presence she found space to heal. She began to help around the ranch in return, mending fences, tending a small garden, rediscovering skills she had set aside when survival consumed everything else. The land changed with the seasons, and so did she, strength returning to her limbs, confidence to her voice. She no longer flinched at every sound, no longer measured the world solely by threat. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of color that turned the sky into something holy, she stood beside him on the ridge where he had first watched her struggle alone. The shelter below was barely visible now, integrated into the landscape, a testament to what could be built when someone chose to act instead of turn away. He told her quietly that riding over with that lumber had been the best decision he'd made in years. She believed him, because she felt the truth of it in her own bones. And as the stars came out, she realized that sometimes salvation didn't arrive with miracles or grand speeches, but with straight boards, open hands, and the courage to help someone rebuild. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that kindness still has a place in a hard world, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of resilience, hope, and the quiet moments that change lives forever. Your support helps these stories reach more hearts, and together, we can keep building something stronger than broken boards.